Welcome, welcome. We'll give folks another minute or two to come on board. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Overcoming the Five Deadly Sins of Strategy workshop. As you file in, no matter what you're watching this on, I'd love for you to uh, reach out and type in the chat what brought you here. What made this workshop interesting enough for you to spend some time with me today? Give it about one more minute here. As I get comfortable, we're in for a really good time. Wait, sound check. Am I coming? Okay. How about now? Sound check. One, two, three. Okay. I think I was coming in very low. My apologies. So, as you roll into here, thank you, Russell, for that. As you come on in, tell us what brought you here. Uh, do so via chat. Curiosity. Curiosity works. Well, I hope to satisfy that curiosity um, over the next 30 minutes or so. With that said, let's get to it. Let's start off with the fact that most strategies are done wrong by teams. In fact, teams often don't quite nail what strategy is. So, before we get started, I'd like to define strategy for all of us so that we're working on the same page as we talk about these five deadly sins. So, what is strategy? Strategy is a tool that keeps your team aligned to tackle the biggest problem that your organization faces. The singular there is important because strategy is designed to take on the most impactful problem that you're there to solve. It's a tool to guide your team to the product vision, the mission, the overall structure. Why does your company exist? What new world does the company want to create by doing its work? Strategy is problem focused. As I mentioned before, problem is key. What is the problem that helps us, that is stopping us from creating that new vision? And really good strategy will tell you not just what you're tackling, but what you're ignoring. So we're tackling X and we're ignoring Y and Z because X is more important to us. Strategy is descriptive. It helps anyone who reads it see and accept the complexity of the world in which it exists. It helps the person reading it make decisions based on that descriptive nature. For example, a really good strategy would say we're a company that focuses on speed to accomplish blah, blah, blah. It's a descriptive term for the company. It allows the person who is reading it to see what the focus is. Lastly, speeds up decision making. A lot of strategies, and I include myself as a part of this when I was first starting to make strategies, are very academic. That's not a good strategy. So, strategies that tell you all about the world itself and strategies that tell you a bunch of footnotes and they're overly long and go into every single detail, that's not useful. Strategies are designed to speed up decision making. So, to follow on that speed example from earlier, if I tell you we focus on speed over completeness, that helps you make decisions. Versus if I told you we focus on completeness over speed, also helps you make decisions. Good strategy is alive. However, when it comes to strategy, unfortunately, many teams tend to take the opposite tact. They tend to make strategy slow. In fact, you might have seen or been a part of a strategy planning session, which is counter to what Roger Martin, who wrote Playing to Win and is a professor of strategy at the University of Toronto, says. Right? He tells us strategy is the opposite of planning. Strategy is the opposite of planning. Strategy is the opposite of planning. Strategy is alive. Planning is dead. If I go work on a plan, the plan is static. We're going to go A, B, C, D, and E. If something goes wrong, well, we have to stop and scrap a new plan. Strategy doesn't quite tell you where you're going. It just gives you the tools to get there. It helps you make decisions. And so, with that understanding of strategy, I'd like to move forward to talk about why teams mostly get this wrong, right? Even if you have the right strategy, creating the strategy isn't the hard part. The hard part is we're getting some audio trouble. Okay, that should help. The other part here is teams have a real problem with executing the strategy. In fact, 90% of organizations fail to execute their strategy successfully. 90%. So even if we have a world in which we work on the strategy itself, what happens in our organizations is we tend to react. Remember, strategy is alive. It is proactive. It is something that helps us drive to solving the problems that we are looking to solve. One of the reasons why we have a problem with strategy and we don't execute it well is the fact that we think we're making points. We think we're helping people understand what our strategy is. We think things are very clear to the rest of the organization. But as George Bernard Shaw says, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. How much energy goes into the work of creating strategy? How much energy goes into the kickoff of said strategy? How much work goes into, frankly, the lip service that we spend on strategy? But when we think about it, think about the strategy itself, how much work do we do when it comes to communicating that strategy? Now, how do you know if your strategy is being communicated and used? Well, there's a pretty easy way of doing that. I wonder if this screen is familiar to you. For those who have never seen this screen before, this is a screen that is inside of your Google Doc, right? Any Google file that you have, you can access this screen by clicking the three dots that are on the toolbar and seeing what the viewer trends are. This is the viewer trend screen. Now, you know your strategy is being used because this screen should be very, very active, because this will tell you who has viewed your document. What are the trends this document has? Who's commenting? Who is sharing, right? If your strategy is being used, this is a very popular strategy, then this screen should be very active. Unfortunately, if you go to the strategy, for most people, it tends to look like this, where the creator of the strategy may look at it, and maybe even every once in a while, a direct report of the person who's created the strategy may look at it. Rarely, if ever, or the person who's created the strategy boss may look at it. But it gets kind of lonely here. And most strategies end up in what I call the Google Drive graveyard. This is where your strategies tend to end up when they look like this, when the viewer screen looks like this, because it represents the fact that no one is using your strategy to make decisions. They're not reading it. They're not engaging with it. They're not commenting on it. It exists as a paperweight. And unfortunately, most strategies exist as a paperweight. So, what is your job with strategy when it comes to communication and execution of strategy? What are we doing to make sure that we don't end up here or here, but in a very active screen? Well, as a leader, your job is to create the environment where strategy is implemented. You're here to make sure your strategy works. You are the strategy's custodian. And so your work, especially as it relates to the proactive things that help us consciously build the vision that we want to see, requires you as a leader to create that environment where strategy is implemented. And if you're an individual contributor, your job, if you choose to accept it, is to prompt leadership and show them what is happening on the ground. How do you create feedback cycles that allow your leadership to adjust? Either way, if you're finding yourself in a space where you see this or this, or you're feeling this, you're probably ending up in a space where you're dealing with the five deadly sins, right? You have to avoid those five deadly sins. The five deadly sins of strategy are five behaviors, mostly unconscious, that I notice that teams commit, both leaders and sometimes individual contributors, that leads their strategies to end up back here in the graveyard. What are those five deadly sins? Well, first is hiddenness. Ask yourself, does anybody know this strategy exists? And in the chat here, Russell brings up the point that the company may not be in the same page. Well, oftentimes
It's because the strategies that people have, people don't connect them. They don't connect the dots. And a lot of times that's because the strategy is hidden. No one knows where it is. It's not brought up on a regular basis, so people forget about it. Strategies can be ambiguous. Ask yourself, who is this strategy for? What is it for? What does it drive? Teams tend to start to talk about cool things that they're doing, but it doesn't come together for a narrative, right? And without that narrative, people cannot follow along. Third is selfishness. And this is something that I've seen a lot of teams do, particularly product teams, where they'll talk about what their strategy or what the product strategy does for them. But as I often like to say, product is not a solo sport, it's a team sport. And so if you write a selfish strategy, you're not giving folks the opportunity to lean in and give their input. It's also something, to Russell's point, which may lead to people creating their own strategies and going their own way because, well, what is it in for me? What does this have to do with me? Next is staleness. Strategy is alive, plans are dead. If your strategy isn't being updated, then it becomes a plan. And then the plan gets ignored because plans are often wrong. And then untrustworthiness. How well does the rest of the organization know you? How well do the people that work with you know you? How can this strategy build trust in our work? And so we're going to go over each of these five deadly sins. And I'm going to give you some tools that'll help you absolve yourself from each of these. Let's start with hiddenness. We're going to use a fictional company I call Bobco to help clarify a few of these concepts, right? And so Bobco, think of Bobco as this fake company. It's a fintech company that is about a Series B. They have they have a few product teams, and they're out in the world uh, trying to help their customers lean into saving money. And so at Bobco, we have a couple of product teams, and we're going to go use Bobco. We're going to use Bobco as a way to look at these product teams and engage. And so we're going to start with hiddenness, and we're going to start with hiddenness and Jane's team. And so Jane's team spent the last few weeks building a strategy to contend with the rise of AI in the marketplace, right? It's something that a lot of us are dealing with. The team felt great about it as it detailed the work necessary to make data more ingestible for AI use. After about 9 months of work, however, Jane and the team noticed that they were seldom proactive. The team itself was wondering what was next, and it soon became clear that no one knew what the strategy was. They were acting on reactions and nothing nothing else. So, what happened? Well, usually when you see hiddenness, you see a team or a strategy that is unseen and inaccessible. And it leads to misaligned and disjointed efforts. So, if your team is unsure about the organization's direction or priorities or how work contributes to those overarching goals, a lot of times they just don't know where the strategy is. And so they miss out on the opportunity to engage. And so when you don't have a clear and accessible strategy, teams cannot align their efforts with common objectives. That's how teams fall into the reactive phase. They don't know where we're going. And so they just see what's in front of them. And if you're a leader, you need to become the custodian of your strategy. You have to make sure that your strategy is transparent, easily accessible, and also communicated often. Ask yourself, how often do I create a carve out 5, 10 minutes and just say, here's where we are with our strategy. here's where we're going. Here's some things that are happening that may change what is in front of us. I promise you, adding something as simple as a 5 to 10 minute carve out will do wonders for people knowing where the strategy is and asking questions. You can start to build out an understanding, and teams will be connecting with what is important. Now, if you're an individual contributor and you're working on a team with a hidden strategy, you have opportunity, right? And so for each of these sins, I want to make sure if you are someone that is working on a strategy and you don't have the power to change strategy or even to start throwing things on the calendar, I want to give you some tools to be able to help steer your leader into a clear direction, right? And I think the easiest way to do that as an individual contributor is to leverage questions, especially if you leverage questions in a one-on-one with your leader. I know as a product leader, whenever I got questions from my team, especially privately about these things, it helped me think through what was clear to them and what wasn't. And so I think as an individual contributor with your leadership, sitting down when you have some alone time with them and really hashing some of these out through questions will help absolve the team of the sin as well. Not just that, as an IC, there's an opportunity to help you learn if you're looking to become a leader at some point. Asking these questions are the questions that you're going to start to ask yourself as you start to make your own strategy. So let's start with hiddenness, as I mentioned. As an IC, during your next one-on-one, what you may want to ask is, hey, can you clarify our current projects, right? And how they align with our strategic objectives. So, hey, just want to see where things are. And how does my work play into that? Another question you might want to ask is, how do I find the most updated version of our strategy? I'd like to use it as our team thinks through things. Or, if you're a product person, we like to adjust our backlog against the strategy, right? Again, another way to ask for the up-to-date version without directly just asking for the up-to-date version. Right? These are questions that you can ask, or similar questions that help a leader say, hey, maybe our strategy isn't as clear as we thought it was, and maybe they'll create spaces for that. So back at Bobco, all Jay needed to do was to add a strategy session in the weekly planning meetings of about 15 minutes to discuss what happened so far and how they may change strategy based on everyone's view. She went around to each team that she was working with and just did that, right? Just 10 minutes. And it allowed everyone to see and engage with the strategy as it was being built, as time was going on. So that's hiddenness, right? How might you make the strategy clear and accessible to everyone, and then just keep repeating it? Next is ambiguity. So back at Bobco, Larry's team were very excited about how energetic the teams were. And then they had a clear planning session and a clear kickoff meeting. The team set themselves up to success, right? They were even bringing it up during regular intervals. So everybody was engaged. Except at the end of the year, they looked up and realized they didn't really make much headway on anything. In fact, there's no real narrative when it comes to the strategy. It's just a bunch of projects. And while people enjoy the projects, over time, if you just keep building projects, you're not making any movement towards your vision, right? It just creates more and more complexity that you have to deal with down the line. Not only that, the team didn't learn much. So they felt deflated as they started their next strategy cycle. So what happened? How clear is your objective or target audiences? If you don't have a clear objective or clear target audiences or clear problem, teams just start pursuing projects reactively. What's the last piece of feedback that I got? Who's the loudest person in the room? What did I see on the news, right? All these things start to drive projects. And one of the principal points we have with strategy Why do we have strategy in the first place? Why do we need to go through all of this song and dance to create strategy? Well, it helps bring some alignment to the work that we do so that we can learn over a strategy cycle how and why things are where they are and how and we can get to the vision that we're looking for. So, how do you know when this is happening? Teams may pursue projects with zeal, but without a clear understanding of what success looks like or how their work impacts the product strategy, right? Teams are going out and they're just building things. Um, One of the tools I like when it comes to absolving this is the 5 W's. If you don't know what the 5 W's are, the 5 W's are who, what, where, why, and how. Oh, who, what, where, why, and when. How is it this? Sometimes H. Sometimes I say it. It goes with it. Anywho, for this case, it's the 5 W's. When you're creating a problem, or when you're creating a diagnosis of the problem that you're going to engage with strategy, being super clear about those 5 W's gives you a narrative. It gives people who read it a sense of what you're going after. And if you bring them up every time you communicate and you tell a story, whenever a team starts to create a project, they'll be able to reference that and make a decision. Now, this requires your company to generally have a ICP or ideal customer profile. If they do not, then as a leader, it's time for you to start agitating to create that because it's going to make your work much easier. If you're an IC on that team, bring up the 5 W's during your next meeting. What are they? What is happening? Why is it happening? Where is it happening? When is it happening? Who is it happening to? Or come to the meeting with your 5 W's plotted out and say, okay, this is what I think these are. Could you help me align? Or you can ask, hey, we just got this new initiative. How does it serve our target customer? Or even better, I'd like to tell a story to our stakeholders that are outside of our team. Here are some main characters that I have and challenges that I see. I'd like to make sure that this is aligned with the strategy that we have. So you want to start to create a narrative. And the more specific you are with that narrative, the more people can grasp onto where you're trying to go. And as I mentioned before, what you're learning, right? You can start to understand and find learnings and apply them to the work that you're doing. So at Bobco, Larry started to put this information front and center in every presentation. He put the 5 W's in front of every presentation and just went through them. He also told his team to start doing the same. All of his teams to start doing the same. And so every time they launched an initiative, they say, who is this for? And then, as I mentioned before, one of the great things about this is the ability to learn. And so after that first slide, he had them write a slide that said, our last release taught us X, Y, and Z and gets us further or closer to our vision in this way, right? Now you're starting to establish a very clear point of view about what you're trying to go after, what the problem is, and as you're talking or engaging with other teams, they have a very clear way of being able to place what is happening in their own heads as they start to make their own decisions. I mentioned closer or further. It brings us to untrustworthiness. Now, untrustworthiness is often a sin that is wrapped up in a lack of information. Teams don't like to hear that they've always won, or you always winning, or they don't get a sense of your wins and losses. And so when teams don't get a sense of what's happening in your space, they start to trust you less and less. And at Bobco, Hannah ran into this with her team. So she thought her and her team had a great strategy. And the people inside of the team felt very empowered. That said, when she talked to other stakeholders, they were indifferent at best and hostile at worst. When she needed information for the team to do its job. After about 9 months, someone from sales pulled her aside and said, everything that your team does is a secret. Product's a black hole. We don't know what is working and what doesn't. So other departments feel like you don't tell the truth all the time. I've run into this a lot with product teams, unfortunately, right? Because with the pressures of the job, a lot of us feel like we only need to talk about successes. But over time, that starts to pull people away because they don't have a good sense of who you are, or all of us have problems. Why are you always coming with us with problems during meetings, but when we're doing presentation, there's nothing ever is wrong with you, right? It turns people off. So you're not getting buy-in. Teams don't know what success looks like or how your projects win or lose based on that success, right? And so if you don't have trust, if people don't believe in your strategy or don't believe in your data or don't believe in what you're doing, then they're not connecting, right? And so they have their own stuff. Everybody has their own thing. Everybody's busy with their own thing. And so as a leader, it's your job to build credibility. You need to make sure that your strategies are realistic, align with the organizational values, because that creates a language for everyone to speak in. And demonstrating commitment through honest reporting. Hey, we won here, we lost here. This is what our strategy means. If you're an individual contributor and you find this, you find yourself in the space and you want to improve the trustworthiness of the work that you're doing, ask a couple questions like, how does the strategy benefit the organization as a whole? I want to understand what's happening out there. Have we considered the impact of this strategy on all groups? This is kind of a hint to the next sin, but if your strategy and the stuff that you're doing is impacting other groups negatively, then of course they don't trust you. Right? Customer success has to clean up the release mess, right? Or sales doesn't feel supported, so their win rates drop when you release things. That's going to lead them to not trust you. And sometimes just connecting with other teams. And I know sometimes leaders get weird about this, but it's always worth the question. Hey, I'd like to accompany Team X for a day to learn about how our product affects them. Can I do that? Can I go hang out with sales for a day, or customer success for a day, or engineering for a day, whatever, right? Because that's going to give you an idea of who they are, what's important to them, and what are their signals for trust. So one of the things Hannah did at Bobco was to start posting the product postmortems when things failed, right? When things didn't work, she would, in the public Slack channel, talk about, this is why it failed. This is how we're going to do better. This is how it affects the strategy. And so other teams really appreciated that honesty. And in turn, they started sharing more information. So whenever the wins came in, it made sense. Everything started to make sense in their heads as it related to what is happening with the team and what is happening with product. I hinted at this, but selfishness. What is this strategy? How does this strategy affect anyone else? How does this strategy affect the people in which are engaged with it, especially for my product people here. When you talk about product strategy, product's not a solo sport. So you're going to need everybody's information in order to make better decisions for the team. Now, for every other discipline, selfishness doesn't help you either because information from everyone else and everybody else's buy-in tends to make your job easier, right? Whether it's a sales strategy, whether it's a communication strategy, right? You don't want teams to be reactive because they are feel forced to give you information. That information comes a lot easier if the teams feel like you have a stake in their success. And so at Bobco, Scott ran into this, right? Scott felt great about his strategy. And he was sure everyone else saw the value because the first few launches were very successful. The R&D teams felt very empowered, and people regularly shared the product story at the all hands meeting, right? The product people, the R&D teams, everybody felt great until he sat with other leaders, and some of the things that he learned at a retrospective let him know that, wow, other teams feel like we're very transactional. So Scott pulled someone to the side and say, hey, why why am I just kind of noticing this? I'm kind of surprised. And the answer he got back was, hey, your strategy only seems to be about your team. People like you, Scott. They like the people on your team. You're successful, so they help. But at this point, the goodwill is wearing thin. And I'm just friendly advice, right? Which oftentimes as a leader is the best advice you're going to get, right? When somebody's that candid with you. So how did that happen? They didn't bring up anybody else's objectives in their strategies when they were talking about them, or when they talked about who it was affecting, or even when they talked about their wins and losses. So when you talk about the benefits only to your group, or only one department, or only to one side of the business, the other side, who you're leaving out, may not say it, but they feel disconnected. And over time, they're going to stop engaging with your strategy. And so you're going to miss out on the ability to execute. For your strategy to be successful, you have to bring in data from everyone, right? You got to have some sense of how their teams are feeling. And so the way you bring people in is to talk about what's important to them. As a leader, spend some time with other teams. Ask what they're looking to do. Ask what's important to them. And start to bring some of that language back into your strategy. And when you do your updates, when something affects more than just your team, bring it up. Hey, this is going to be super helpful. This release is going to be super helpful to our customer success teams because this release really knocks down the bug rate. So we perceive that we're going to have a drop in customer support interventions, right? People start to see that the strategy that you are presenting is very, very, very inclusive. And so that culture of inclusivity breaks you out of that selfishness realm. Now, if you are an IC, this and the trust conversation questions are very similar. And so how do we measure success for this project against the 5 W's for other teams, right? So you have the 5 W's, you go in there and you say, hey, I think this affects sales. How does this affect sales? Always bringing it back to the target customer. And yeah, really bringing that focus on the selfishness. And I think the ambiguity card got doubled. So sorry about that. We'll fix it later. But yeah, you want to, for the selfishness piece, you want to make sure that you're asking questions about how it affects other teams. And so Scott ran one of my favorite workshopping sessions called a lean coffee, in which he got the other stakeholders to sit down and engage in a light workshopping session, which started off with a current state presentation, less than 10 minutes. This is what's happening around us. And then he asked every participant to ask questions, and make comments via post it note. They all voted on the most important, and then they discussed them collectively. And so this workshop session often reveals what other teams care about, so you can start to change your language to address them proactively. This is a great workshop to connect with peers on. And if you're a leader, I would try to have one of these once a month, at least, with different stakeholders, right? Especially your peers, right? If you're a leader of sales, having this with your a product leader, an engineering leader, a design leader, a customer success leader, right, can bring a lot of insight. Likewise for any other leader, like just doing this once a month is, I think, is a great way of creating that type of space. And last, we're going to talk about staleness. Teams often forget to update the strategy. And if I'm being honest, right, it's very easy to do that, especially if you feel good about these other four sins and you're doing it well, right? Things are going good. People are happy. People feel the motion. But ask yourself, have you gone back and updated all the paperwork? Have you made sure that the story still makes sense? It's very important to not have a stale strategy. Strategy is alive. And so the longer you don't engage with the strategy and update it, the more stale it gets. The more stale it gets, as people read it, they feel that, and they don't really engage with it. And so at Bobco, Alicia and her leadership team spent more than 3 months crafting the strategy, and they found a lot of success over that first 6 months. And then the second half of the year saw a huge drop in efficacy. Feature usage dropped. Because they never adjusted the strategy based on competitive data that they got, right? They did a retrospective and they made a timeline, and they were able to identify right when things changed. And things changed based on a confluence of issues, mostly based on competition and regulation, but they never adjusted. They never told anybody. They just kept going. And so a competitor picked up on this and they took market share. So they weren't being proactive. They didn't actively update the strategy. And so strategies become stale when they do not evolve. Ask yourself, when are you evolving the strategy? Because business is dynamic. Sticking to a stale strategy can lead to missed opportunities. And so as a leader, you should establish a process for a strategy review. That group that you have a lean coffee with, it's a great group to have a strategy review with. Take an hour out of a month, maybe 2 hours in a quarter, and just say, hey, we're going to dedicate 2 hours to reviewing the strategy and saying what we need to change and what we don't. And then making sure at the end of that meeting, you're connecting that long-term strategy with the vision. Copy this ambiguity again. Well, we'll fix that later. As an IC, what you want to do with stale strategies is just ask, when is the last time we updated this? I'd like to update this based on this information. You can also offer up information as an IC that tells the leader, hey, this is going on. I'd like to ask, how is this going to change our strategy? And so back at Bobco, Larry started a strategy review meeting. And he would do this every 6 weeks or so, where the teams would get together and say, okay, this is what's happening. Give me some data. We've made these changes. This affects our problem. This affects some initiatives that we have coming up. Here are the updates. And then we'd create, at the next all hands meeting, a slice that says, okay, here are our strategy updates. And so they were able to get a lot more clarity. Remember, I think one of the most important things to remember as it relates to strategy is the fact that it's a forcing function. If you're noticing things that aren't moving, if you notice a lack of clear outcomes, if you notice a graveyard, you feel this, then you're probably not executing strategy at a high level because you end up in the graveyard when you do not have a strategy that forces people to move. It does not work. Strategy does not work if it is a plan that is static and dead. Strategy only works as a forcing function that's alive that avoids those five deadly sins. And so, with that, I hope you got some good information out of this. Really quickly, over the next 2 minutes or so, I'd love for you to fill out this form. Take your camera out, fill out this form. It's going to give me some feedback. I would love to get feedback from everyone here because it'll allow me to improve this presentation. Right? I'm giving this presentation free because I want to get better. I want to make it better. And so your input would help me do that. And if you have questions, send them through that feedback. Send it through that form. I will answer all of them. So I'll give you a few minutes here. Ooh. Wow. Another 30 seconds here for feedback. All right. So I'm gonna open it up to Q&A, but before I do, here's my friend Chris. Chris is a product leader. He's currently at Copilot, but when he did this work, when he used my stuff, he was at Google as a lead PM at TensorFlow, and so he used the concept I've created called survival metrics to help measure strategic progress as they were building their AI technology. Um, if you'd like to learn more about that, if you'd like to learn more about strategy, if you'd like to learn more about metrics, um, I'd like to invite you to send me a note. Here's another QR code, leads to a different form, but this one is more serious about working together. So I'm going to leave this up and I am going to open it up for questions. I believe I have one in the chat here in Zoom, which I will answer. But if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat here and I will get to them. So Russell gives a question. Does strategy begin with company mission, product value proposition, user needs, company goals, and marketing growth strategy? So when I think about creating strategy, I think strategy begins with a problem. And where do you get the problems from? You get the problems from having a very clear mission, or some people call this vision, some people call it mission, some people call it a different world in which the company wants to create, whatever, right? there's something that the company wants to do over a long period of time. And so, whether that's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, the company is trying to do something. And so, your strategy is a chunk of that. It's just a piece, right? It's the connecting part from what you're doing on a daily or quarterly basis. Then your strategy is what is happening over the span of a year, 18 months, maybe 2 years. And then you put a couple of those strategies together, and then you end up with your vision or company mission. And so when you start with a clear vision, then that should guide you to the problems that you're looking to solve. That said, if there isn't a great clear vision, that's okay, right? There's probably a long-term problem that you need to solve anyway. That's coming up based on what is happening in the world of your vertical, what is happening in the world, period, regulation, whatever. There's probably something big that you need to take on. And so, if that's the case and you don't have a mission or very much clarity there, focus on the biggest problem that you can solve and go for that. One of the tools that I find very helpful in this process is one, the book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, which is a very helpful tactical book designed to help you create good strategy. Big fan of it. Chris, who I mentioned earlier, has a great uh, article on something called a proto strategy. I don't have the link. I would recommend going to Google and just typing in Chris Butler proto strategy. He has a great method of creating a long form strategy that forces you to lay out all of these different forces and start to cut. And so I have found in my career that writing all this stuff out will help you see the problem much clearly. And then the force by editing it, you're forcing yourself to be very clear about priorities. Also, if you want help on just strategy itself, hit me up here. I'm more than happy to walk you through and go with a huge deep dive, right? We can spend some real time going over your current strategy and we can help prioritize. So, fellow Adam here on LinkedIn, hello, fellow Adam, mentions that there is a sin on the flip side of staleness that is changing the strategy too often. Do you have any thoughts or feedback on that? That one's interesting to me because I rarely see teams updating their strategy and changing their strategy too often. It feels like one of those. Feels like one of the problems, right? Where I often get when people talk about, "Hey, do you pivot too fast? Do you see teams pivoting too much?" Right? I rarely see that. What I do see is not teams changing the strategy; it's teams with no strategy just moving forward and doing things. Right? They're acting very, very, very reactively, and so if you find yourself in a space that is or a team that's acting very reactively, one of two things needs to happen. One, you have to change your container of what strategy is. So for startups, strategy, it's just a matter that strategy will change fairly often just because you're trying to find product market fit. And there are different tools, for example, product impact mapping, which I think is very useful for teams to start to figure that out and come to some sort of solid ground if they are a newer team or a startup. Or teams have to go back and get very serious about what problem they're solving, why is it a problem, and get to the space where they need to disagree and commit. Because again, that's not a strategy changing. That's a team being proactive. A team being reactive based on whoever is more influential in the moment when teams are engaging. And so that tells me a leadership team has not sat down and they have not had the discussion yet. Or if they had the discussion, right? They don't believe each other, and that's a way bigger problem that can't really be fixed uh, through tactics, right? That's that you need a deep cleaning, in a sense, to get a leadership team uh, where they need to be. For that, I would recommend for that leadership team, you could always have somebody like me come in. But if you don't, there's a great book called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. Highly recommend. Um, it lays out why teams do this, and it gives some tools, especially to leadership teams, on how to fix it. Any other questions? All right. If not, I want to thank everybody for joining me here. This has been a fantastic day. We got a little couple of issues with the audio, but I'm trying a new setup, trying a new presentation, part of the program. But I appreciate you all for joining me. Thank you. And if you have any questions, of course, reach out. Talk to you later.